My name is Mark. I'm 42 years old, and for the last decade, my life has been defined by what I can capture through a lens. Before that, it was defined by what I could see through a rifle scope. I did 8 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment. When I got out, I swapped one kind of long-range observation for another. Instead of spotting enemy movements in the Hindu Kush, I started tracking elk herds in the Rockies. It was a quieter life, a better one. The skills, however, were surprisingly transferable. Patience, an eye for detail, the ability to sit motionless for hours, becoming just another part of the landscape, and an unshakable understanding of how the natural world is supposed to work, the rhythms of it, the sounds, the silences, the way everything fits together in a perfect, logical system. That understanding was the bedrock of my sanity, my career, and my life after the service. And it's what I lost, completely and irrevocably, during 3 days at a cabin I'd known since I was a boy. The trip was Megan's idea, my wife's. She thought it would be good for us to get away from the city, and she wanted to do something with her side of the family, her brother Cal and his 16-year-old daughter Alyssa. Cal and I always got along. He was a hunter, a man who knew his way around the woods, though more for sport than for a living. He was practical, grounded, the kind of man you want with you when things go sideways. Megan and Alyssa were a different story. They were city people, through and through. The idea of no cell service and a pit toilet was a source of genuine anxiety for them. But they were trying, for our sake. The plan was a long weekend at my family's old hunting cabin in the Allegheny National Forest. It wasn't a vacation rental, it was a legacy. Built by my grandfather, maintained by my father, and now, my responsibility.
The cabin itself was nothing special. A single large room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area partitioned off, and a sleeping loft. It was solid, built from timber cleared from the same patch of land, and it sat at the absolute end of a 6-mile unpaved logging road. To get there, you had to want to be there. There were no neighbors. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive, assuming the road was dry. It was isolated in a way that felt profound, a pocket of the world that time and technology had mostly forgotten. For me and Cal, that was the appeal. For Megan and Alyssa, it was the primary source of their unease. Still, the first evening went exactly as planned. We got there in the late afternoon, unpacked the trucks, and I got a fire roaring in the hearth while Cal split more wood. The smell of pine and wood smoke filled the air, a scent I associated with my happiest childhood memories. As dusk settled, painting the dense canopy of trees in shades of orange and purple, we sat on the porch. Cal and I had beers, Megan had a glass of wine she'd brought, and Alyssa was glued to her phone, trying to suck the last dregs of a signal out of the ether before it vanished completely. We talked about nothing and everything. Cal was excited about the upcoming deer season, and he and I fell into an easy conversation about ballistics and the best spots to set up a tree stand. Megan listened with a patient smile, the same one she always had when I started talking about things she didn't quite understand but knew I loved. Brian, a mutual friend who was supposed to join us, had canceled at the last minute, something about a work emergency. His absence was noted with a few jokes about his reliability, a light-hearted moment that, in retrospect, feels like a cruel twist of irony. He was the joker of our group, always ready with a sarcastic comment. His presence might have kept things light for a little longer, or maybe his carelessness would have just made him the first victim. I try not to think about that. The normalcy of it all was thick and comforting. The gentle hum of insects, the crackle of the fire inside, the easy laughter. We were a family, disconnected from the world, together. This was the baseline. This was the world as it was supposed to be. Stable, predictable, safe. It was the last time I would ever feel that way. Later that night, after Megan and Alyssa had claimed the beds in the loft and Cal had taken the pull-out sofa, he and I stayed up for one last drink by the dying embers of the fire. The woods outside were a wall of blackness beyond the windows.
The night sounds were a familiar chorus, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the leaf litter. It was the soundtrack of every night I'd ever spent there. And then a new sound entered the mix. It came from deep in the woods, far off toward the ridge. It was a low, guttural noise, a sort of drawn-out growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a coyote's yip or a bear's huff. It had a resonance, a depth that was all wrong. Cal and I both froze, our glasses halfway to our lips. We looked at each other, our shared experience in the outdoors creating an instant, silent communication. "What the hell was that?" Cal whispered, his voice tight. I shook my head, straining to listen. I ran through the checklist in my head. Bear? No, I'd heard bears fighting, bluff charging. This was different. Deeper, more controlled. A bull moose? Possible, but highly unlikely in this part of Pennsylvania. They were rare, and the sound wasn't quite right for a rutting call. Could be an echo, I offered, not believing it myself. Sound does funny things in these valleys at night. Cal grunted, unconvinced. He walked to the window and peered out into the darkness, but there was nothing to see. The sound didn't repeat. After a few minutes of tense silence, the familiar night sounds slowly crept back in, as if the woods themselves were cautiously resuming their normal rhythm. We tried to shrug it off. We talked ourselves into believing it was a trick of the acoustics, a distant sound from the highway carried on the wind, anything but what it felt like, something unknown and powerful, announcing its presence. We finished our drinks and went to bed, but the seed of unease had been planted. The perfect, logical system had just produced a data point that didn't fit. The next morning broke clear and cool. The sunlight streaming through the dusty windows seemed to burn away the anxieties of the night. It was easy to believe, in the bright light of day, that we had overreacted. Megan and Alyssa came down from the loft, complaining about the lumpy mattresses but otherwise refreshed. I made coffee on the propane stove, and the smell of it, mixed with frying bacon, was so wonderfully normal that the memory of the sound began to feel like a dream. After breakfast, Cal went out to the woodpile to grab more logs for the fireplace. He was gone for longer than he should have been. When he came back inside, he didn't have any wood. He just closed the door quietly behind him and looked at me. The easygoing demeanor from the morning was gone, replaced by a look I recognized from my time in the service. It was the look of a man who has just encountered something that changes the entire tactical situation. "Mark," he said, his voice low so the women wouldn't overhear. "Come take a look at this." I followed him outside. The air was crisp. The woods were alive with the chatter of birds and squirrels. Everything looked exactly as it should. He led me around the side of the cabin to the damp earth near the edge of the forest where the wood was stacked. He pointed. "Look." There in the soft ground were tracks. They were huge, far larger than any animal native to these woods should make. The first one was a deep impression, about 16 inches long, vaguely canine, but with a distinct heel print that was all wrong. It was the kind of detail a biologist or a seasoned tracker would notice, but it was the second print that made the blood run cold in my veins. It was 5 feet away from the first, in a direct line, a perfect bipedal stride. "That's not a bear," I said, stating the obvious. A bear can walk on its hind legs for short distances, but it leaves a shambling, awkward trail. This was a stride. This was the track of something that walked on 2 legs as its primary mode of locomotion. The print itself was distorted, but it was clear that whatever made it was immensely heavy. "No," Cal agreed. It's not a bear. He followed the faint trail for a few yards as it led from the woodpile and disappeared into the dense undergrowth. Whatever it was, it came right up to the cabin last night. Stood right here. We stood in silence for a long moment, the implications of what we were looking at sinking in. This wasn't an echo. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was physical evidence. We tried to rationalize it. Could it be a prank? Some local in a costume trying to scare the city folk? It seemed absurd. The dedication it would take, the risk of getting shot, and who would have a costume that left tracks like this? We considered the possibility of a known animal with some kind of deformity, but the size, the weight, the stride, none of it added up to anything in our shared encyclopedia of the natural world. My logical system was failing, producing error after error. We should pack up, Cal said, his voice grim. Get Megan and Alyssa, and just go. I hesitated.
Part of me, the ranger part, agreed. An unknown variable, a potential threat. The smart move is to withdraw to a secure position. But another part of me, the part that had owned this land for generations, the part that prided himself on being rational, rebelled. Leave because of a weird sound and some funny tracks? We'd be the laughingstock. Megan and Alyssa were already on edge. Trying to explain this to them would just cause panic. Let's not jump the gun, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Let's just be smart. Keep everyone close to the cabin. No one goes into the woods alone. We'll keep the firearms handy. It's probably nothing. Cal looked from the track to my face, his jaw tight. He was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was screaming at him. But he was also a man who trusted me. He nodded slowly. All right, Mark, your call. But I don't like this. I don't like this one bit. The rest of the day was tense. We didn't tell the women about the tracks. We just told them a bear had been spotted in the area and that we needed to be cautious. It was a plausible lie, and it achieved the desired effect. They agreed to stay on the porch or inside the cabin. The carefree atmosphere of the previous day was gone, replaced by a low-grade, simmering anxiety. Cal and I were a two-man patrol, constantly scanning the tree line, our senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. That afternoon, I decided to do a little reconnaissance of my own. It was a stupid decision, born of arrogance and a refusal to accept that I was not in control of the situation. I told Cal I was going to set up a camera trap down by the creek, about 300 yards from the cabin, hoping to get a shot of whatever was making the tracks. It was a lie. I was going to hunt the hunter. I took my camera with its long telephoto lens and my .308 rifle, and I slipped into the woods.
I moved slowly, using the skills I hadn't needed in years, placing each footfall carefully, my eyes scanning, my ears listening. The woods felt different. The usual chorus of life was muted. The squirrels had stopped chattering. The birds were silent. It was a dead quiet, the kind that precedes a predator's attack. I'd felt it before, in Afghanistan, moments before an ambush. The air itself seems to hold its breath. My training screamed at me to fall back, but my pride pushed me forward. I reached the creek and found a spot on a small rise overlooking a game trail. I sat with my back against a thick oak, my rifle across my lap, the camera next to me. I waited. The silence was absolute, pressing in on me. It was unnatural, a vacuum in the soundscape. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, the undeniable sensation of being watched. It's a primal feeling, one that bypasses logic and reason. I was no longer the observer. I was the observed. Slowly, I raised my camera, using the long lens as a pair of binoculars, and began to scan the opposite side of the creek. The trees were thick, a wall of green and brown. I scanned methodically, left to right, top to bottom. Nothing. I was about to lower the camera, to write it off as paranoia, when I saw it. It wasn't a clear view. It was just movement. A flicker of darkness in the deep shadows between two ancient hemlocks. It was too tall to be a deer, too slender to be a bear. It moved with a disturbing fluidity, a flicker of motion that my brain struggled to process. Then it stepped partially into a sliver of sunlight. I saw a leg. A long, powerful leg covered in coarse, dark fur. But it was the joint that made me stop breathing. It was bent backward, like a dog's leg, but it was attached to a torso that was clearly upright. The proportions were nightmarish, a grotesque caricature of anatomy.
It was there for a second, a single, impossible frame, and then it was gone, melting back into the shadows as if it had never been there. I didn't wait for a second look. I grabbed my rifle and camera and scrambled back the way I came. I didn't move quietly this time. I crashed through the undergrowth, my heart hammering against my ribs. The woods were no longer silent. It felt like they were laughing at me. When I burst out of the tree line and back into the clearing of the cabin, Cal was on the porch, his shotgun in his hands, a look of grim understanding on his face. He'd seen the look on my face. "Get inside," I gasped, not needing to explain. "Get everyone inside, now." We herded a confused and frightened Megan and Alyssa into the cabin and barred the door. I told Cal what I'd seen, my voice low and shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and terror. The partial glimpse was worse, in some ways, than a full reveal. It left too much to the imagination, and my imagination was filling in the blanks with things that had no right to exist. Cal just nodded, his face pale. The time for rationalization was over. The threat was real, it was close, and it was something that defied every law of nature we knew. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, we prepared for a siege. Cal and I checked our weapons, making sure they were loaded, with extra ammunition close at hand. We closed the heavy wooden shutters on the windows, plunging the cabin into a premature gloom, lit only by a few battery-powered lanterns. The act of closing those shutters felt deeply symbolic, like we were shutting ourselves into a tomb. Megan, finally understanding the depth of our fear, began to cry softly in a corner, while Alyssa sat in stony, terrified silence, her phone lying forgotten on the table. The sun went down. The profound darkness of the deep woods pressed in on the cabin from all sides. The silence returned, but this time it was not empty. It was full of anticipation. We sat in the dim lantern light, Cal by the back door, me by the front, our firearms resting in our laps. Every creak of the old cabin's wood settling was a footstep. Every gust of wind was a growl. Our nerves were stretched taut, ready to snap. The sounds started just after full dark. They were closer this time, much closer. A low growl, the same one from the night before, but now it was coming from just outside the walls. It wasn't stationary. It was moving, circling the cabin. We could hear its heavy footfalls in the dry leaves, a slow, deliberate patrol. A predator assessing a trap. Then came a new sound, a scratching, a long, slow scrape against the wooden siding on the west wall, the one with no windows. It was the sound of claws being dragged down the planks, a sound of casual, testing strength. Megan let out a small, strangled gasp. I motioned for her to be quiet, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The scratching stopped, and then we heard a heavy thump against the same wall, as if something had leaned its full weight against it. The cabin timbers groaned in protest. Alyssa started to hyperventilate, her breaths coming in ragged, panicked sobs. Megan went to her, holding her, trying to soothe her, but her own fear was a palpable thing in the small room. The psychological pressure was immense. This thing, whatever it was, knew we were inside. It wasn't just a dumb animal, it was toying with us. And then, the most terrifying thing yet, we heard a noise at the back door. Not a scratching or a thump, a metallic click, followed by a slow, deliberate turning. The doorknob. It was jiggling the doorknob. My mind refused to accept it. An animal doesn't turn a doorknob. It doesn't understand the mechanism. This was not an animal.
This was something with manipulative appendages and a problem-solving intelligence. Cal, who was sitting just feet from the door, went rigid. He raised his 12-gauge, the pump-action shotgun looking like a child's toy in the face of such an impossible reality. The knob rattled more insistently now, a furious, frustrated sound. Then, a deafening bang erupted from the front of the cabin. It sounded like a battering ram hitting the front door. My immediate reaction was to swing my rifle toward the front, my focus shifting. Cal did the same, and in that split second of misdirection, the real attack came. The window on the side of the cabin, one of the few we hadn't been able to shutter completely, exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Through the shattered opening, a limb snaked into the room. It was impossibly long, covered in thick, matted, dark fur. It terminated in something that was almost a hand, but not. The fingers were too long, too thin, and tipped with thick, black claws like obsidian daggers. It pawed at the air inside the cabin, blindly searching. The arm bent at an angle that was fundamentally wrong, the elbow joint seeming to have a range of motion that no terrestrial creature should possess. Without a word, Cal pivoted and fired the shotgun. The roar was deafening inside the small space. The blast of buckshot tore into the limb. From outside came a sound that was not a growl or a roar, but a scream of pain and fury, a sound that was shockingly high-pitched and resonant, something that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. The arm recoiled, vanishing from the window. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a new sound. The thud of something heavy hitting the ground, followed by a furious scrabbling. And then it rose. In the dim light spilling from the broken window, I saw it. It unfolded itself from a crouch, rising to its full, terrifying height. It stood at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8. Its shoulders were immense, a solid block of muscle wider than a doorway, but they tapered down to a waist that was unnervingly narrow. The legs, the same ones I had glimpsed by the creek, were bent in a permanent digitigrade stance, like a dog or a cat, the joints clearly visible and powerfully built. It was standing on 2 feet, but it was not human. And the head, God, the head. It was the head of a monstrous wolf or a dire dog, long-snouted and powerful. The fur on its neck was bristled with aggression. Its ears were pointed and alert, swiveling independently to catch every sound. But it was the eyes that held me frozen. They were not the simple, reflective eyes of an animal caught in the light. They were yellow, intelligent, and they burned with a malevolent, thinking hatred. They were looking right at me. As if that wasn't terrifying enough, we heard a second one. A low growl from the other side of the cabin, answering the scream of the first. There were 2 of them. They had used a flanking maneuver on us, a classic military tactic. My mind, reeling with terror, latched onto that single, insane thought. We were being hunted by something that understood infantry tactics. The attack began in earnest then. It was no longer about psychological warfare. It was about brute force.
They threw their bodies against the walls of the cabin, one after the other, in a coordinated assault. The entire structure shook on its foundations. Pictures fell from the mantelpiece. The lanterns flickered and danced. It felt like being inside a drum being beaten by giants. Megan and Alyssa were screaming now, their terror a constant, high-pitched counterpoint to the deep, guttural growls of the creatures outside. I moved to the broken window, trying to get a clear shot, but the creature was smart. It stayed low, using the corners of the cabin for cover. A black shape moving with terrifying speed in the darkness. It was a trained soldier's worst nightmare, an enemy that was stronger, faster, and seemingly impervious to damage, operating on its home turf with an intelligence that matched our own. Then, a heavy log, wielded like a battering ram, crashed through the main front window, the one next to the door, shattering the remaining shutters and sending a fresh cascade of glass and wood into the room. They were using tools. They had picked up a fallen log and were using it to systematically dismantle our fortress. "Mark, the back door!" Cal yelled over the din. I turned to see the back door, the one that had been jiggled, bowing inward under repeated, thunderous blows. The wood was splintering around the lock, the hinges groaning. It wouldn't hold for much longer. We were trapped in a kill box of our own making, with two intelligent, powerful predators systematically breaking it down around us. The feeling was not just fear, it was a profound, soul-crushing helplessness. My training, my logic, my experience, none of it mattered. We were prey. The rules of the world had been rewritten, and we were on the wrong side of the new equation. The back door gave way with a final, explosive crack of splintering wood. It didn't just open, it was torn from its hinges and thrown into the room, as if by a hurricane. Standing in the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the blackness of the night, was the first creature. The one Cal had shot. Its left arm hung limp and mangled at its side, dripping a dark, viscous fluid onto the floor, but it seemed otherwise unbothered by the wound. It filled the entire doorway, its massive shoulders scraping the frame. It lowered its head, its long snout wrinkled back in a snarl that exposed rows of yellow, dagger-like teeth. A low, continuous growl rumbled from its chest, a sound that vibrated in my bones. Time seemed to slow down. Alyssa's screams dissolved into a choked whimper. Megan was frozen, her face a mask of pure horror. My mind was a whirlwind of tactical impossibilities. The creature was blocking the only other exit. We were cornered. My rifle was up, the sights centered on its chest, but the sheer size of it, the monstrous reality of it, was paralyzing. Now! Cal's voice cut through my paralysis. He stood his ground, not 10 feet from the beast, and emptied the remaining shells from his shotgun directly into its torso. The buckshot hit it with the force of a sledgehammer, creating visible impacts on its chest, tearing through fur and flesh. The creature roared, a sound of agony and incandescent rage, and stumbled backward a single step, shaking its massive head. It was wounded, badly, but it wasn't down. It was still on its feet. That was the opening I needed. As its attention was fixed on Cal, the immediate threat, I shifted my aim. My ranger training took over, a cold, detached part of my brain pushing the terror aside. Don't aim for the chest. It's too big, too much muscle. The target is the central nervous system. I put the crosshairs of my .308 right between its glowing yellow eyes. I squeezed the trigger. The report of the high-powered rifle inside the confines of the cabin was apocalyptic. It was a physical blow, a concussive wave of sound that left my ears ringing. The creature's head snapped back with a wet, percussive crack. The light in its eyes vanished. It didn't howl or scream. It just dropped. The 8-foot-tall monster collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, falling backward out of the doorway and landing with a heavy, final thud on the ground outside.
For a heartbeat, there was silence. A deafening, ringing silence. The only sounds were our own ragged breaths and Alyssa's quiet sobbing. We had done it. We had killed it. A wave of nauseating relief washed over me. Then, from the darkness outside, a new sound began. It started as a low moan and rose in pitch and volume until it became a soul-shattering howl. It was a sound of pure anguish and loss, the cry of a creature mourning its fallen packmate. But beneath the grief, there was an undercurrent of something else. Pure, undiluted rage. The second one was still out there, and now we had made it personal. "We have to go." Cal's voice was raspy, strained. I saw then that his arm was bleeding, a long gash from shrapnel from the destroyed doorframe. "We have to go, now, before it gets smart again, or before the sun comes up and it decides to wait for us." He was right. We had a window. The other creature was momentarily disorganized, grieving or confused. It was our only chance. "My truck," I said. "It's our best bet." There was no time to pack, no time to think. We just moved. I grabbed the extra rifle magazines and stuffed them in my pockets. Cal reloaded his shotgun, his hands shaking slightly. "Megan, you get Alyssa. No matter what you hear, you don't stop running until you get to the truck. You understand?" Megan, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes now hard with determination, nodded. We burst out of the ruined cabin and into the cold night air. The body of the creature I had shot was a huge, dark mound on the ground. We didn't look at it. We ran. A frantic, desperate dash across the 50 yards of open ground that separated the cabin from where I'd parked my truck near the logging road. Every shadow seemed to hold a new threat. The howl had stopped, replaced by a terrifying silence. The woods were watching us, holding their breath. We reached the truck. I fumbled for the keys, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Get in, I yelled, pulling the passenger door open for Megan and Alyssa. Cal took up a rearguard position, his shotgun scanning the dark tree line. I got the door open, shoved them inside, and ran around to the driver's side. My hand closed on the handle, and my heart sank. The tire was flat. Not just flat, but shredded. I dropped to a knee and saw the long, clean gashes in the rubber. I scrambled to the back. The rear tire was the same. A quick, horrifying check confirmed it. All 4 tires. Slashed. Clean through the sidewalls with what must have been blade-like claws. It wasn't random damage. It was strategic. It had disabled our escape route while we were pinned down in the cabin. The intelligence of it was staggering and terrifying. "Mark?" Cal's voice was tight with dread. He had seen it too. Panic, cold and absolute, began to set in. "Cal's truck," Megan said from inside the cab, her voice trembling. "His truck is further down the road." It was. He had parked his older, less reliable pickup about a quarter of a mile down the road, where the path widened. It was our only hope. But it was a quarter of a mile on foot, in the dark, with a monster hunting us. And then it appeared. It stepped out of the woods and onto the logging road, blocking our path. It was the second one, and it was bigger. The one I had killed was massive, but this one was a giant. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its frame thicker, its shoulders even broader. The fur was darker, almost black, and its eyes burned with a furious, cold fire. It just stood there, about 100 yards down the road, watching us, a silent, immovable sentinel of death. We were frozen, trapped between a useless truck and an impossible foe. This was it. This was the end. Cal moved. He stepped in front of me, placing himself between us and the creature. He chambered around in his shotgun,
the shuck-shuck sound loud in the stillness.
"Mark," he said, his voice low and steady, not looking at me. "Get them back in the cabin. Barricade what's left of the door. Use the furniture." "Cal, no," I started to say, my voice choking. "We're not leaving you." "That's an order," he growled, and for a second he wasn't my brother-in-law. He was a commander, giving a final, non-negotiable command. He shoved me backward toward the cabin. "I'll buy you time. You get them safe. You keep them safe. That's your only job now. Go!" I looked at his face, illuminated by the cold moonlight. There was no fear in his eyes, only determination. He was making a choice. He was laying down his life for his daughter, for his sister, for me. There was no time to argue, no words that could change his mind. I grabbed Megan and Alyssa from the truck and half-dragged them back toward the shattered cabin. Megan was screaming Cal's name. Alyssa was a dead weight in my arms. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We heard the shotgun blast once, a defiant roar in the night. It was followed by a scream, a human scream. Cal's scream. It was cut off abruptly. Then there was only silence. A terrible, profound, and final silence that swallowed the whole world. We made it inside the cabin. We piled what was left of the furniture against the broken back doorway. I pushed the heavy oak table against the front door. We huddled in the far corner, the one furthest from any windows, and we waited. I sat with my rifle pointed at the darkness, my body numb, my mind a hollowed-out shell. Megan held Alyssa, rocking her back and forth, both of them weeping in a way that was completely silent, as if any sound would bring the monster back. Nothing happened. The hours crawled by, each second an eternity. We listened for footsteps, for growls, for the sound of the barricade being torn apart. But there was nothing. The second creature did not come for us. Maybe it had gotten what it wanted. Maybe its rage was satisfied. Or maybe it was just gone. We didn't know. We only knew the silence was as terrifying as the noise had been. Finally, after a lifetime of darkness, the first hints of gray light began to filter through the broken windows. Dawn. I have never been so grateful to see the sunrise. When the woods were fully illuminated, I cautiously moved the barricade and stepped outside. The world was washed in the clean, cold light of morning. The air was still. The body of the creature I had shot was gone. There was a large, dark stain on the ground where it had fallen, a patch of flattened grass, and nothing else. I walked toward the road, my rifle held ready, my heart a cold lump of dread in my chest. I walked to where we had last seen Cal. The ground was torn up, a scene of a violent struggle. His shotgun lay on the ground, twisted and bent, the stock splintered, and everywhere there was blood. A horrific amount of it, soaking into the gravel of the road. But there was no body. Cal was gone. We didn't go back to the cabin. We left everything. We walked. The 5 longest miles of my life, down that logging road to the main highway. Alyssa was in shock, a walking ghost. Megan was a robot, putting one foot in front of the other, her face a blank slate of trauma. I was on autopilot, scanning the trees, expecting a black shape to emerge at any moment. But we saw nothing. A trucker found us on the side of the highway, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who took one look at our torn clothes, our bloodshot eyes, and the state of my wife and niece, and asked no questions. He just told us to get in, gave us his water, and drove us to the nearest town, to the state police barracks. I told them everything.
I started at the beginning, and I told them every single detail, exactly as it had happened.
I told them about the sounds, the tracks, the creature at the window, the fight, the two creatures, my slashed tires, and what happened to Cal. I watched their faces as I spoke. The initial look of concern slowly morphed into professional skepticism, then into thinly veiled pity. They thought I was in shock, that I was delirious. They went up there, of course, a whole team of them. They found my truck with the slashed tires. They found the wrecked cabin. They found the spent shell casings from my rifle and Cal's shotgun. They found the blood on the road, a lot of it. They even found his bent shotgun. They had a forensics team go over the whole area. The official report came out a few weeks later. Cal was attacked and tragically killed by an unusually aggressive black bear. The damage to the cabin was from the bear trying to get at the food inside. The tires on my truck were clawed and bitten by the same panicked animal. My story? A product of trauma. A hysterical reaction to witnessing a horrific but explainable animal attack. The second creature, the one I killed? A hallucination brought on by extreme stress. The bipedal tracks were dismissed as inconclusive, probably scuff marks left by the bear as it rolled or fought. It was all so neat, so tidy, so logical. They searched for Cal's body for 2 weeks. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers. They found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a bone. He was officially listed as a missing person, presumed deceased. Case closed. The only crack in the official story came from a single man, an older trooper, a guy who looked like he had seen a thing or two in his 30 years on the force. He caught me alone as I was leaving the barracks one day, after another pointless interview. He put a hand on my shoulder and looked me square in the eye. "Son," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I'm not going to write this in any report, but my advice to you is to never come back to these woods.
You and your family. Stay away." He paused, looking out toward the mountains. "There are things in these hills that are older than the roads. Things that don't like being found. You're not the first person to come out of that forest with a story that doesn't make sense." He didn't say he believed me. He didn't have to. In his eyes, I saw the weary acknowledgement of a man who has been tasked with maintaining a version of the world that he knows, deep down, is a lie. It was the only validation I ever received, and it was terrifying. The aftermath was a slow-motion demolition of the life I had known. Megan and I tried, we really did. We went to therapy, we talked, but it was no good. She couldn't look at me without seeing that cabin, without hearing her brother's final scream, and I couldn't look at her without a crushing wave of guilt. I was the one who hesitated to leave. I was the one whose pride put us all in danger. She knew it wasn't my fault, not logically.
But trauma isn't logical. We divorced a year later. It was quiet and amicable and felt like the saddest, most inevitable thing in the world. Alyssa lives with her mother now. She's in intensive therapy. She doesn't speak about what happened. Not to her mother, not to her doctors, not to me. It's a black hole in the center of her life that she just walks around. I see Cal in her eyes sometimes, that same quiet strength. I pray it's enough to get her through. I don't live in the mountains anymore. I sold the cabin and the land for almost nothing to a logging company. I couldn't bear the thought of another family ever staying there. I live in a city now, a place surrounded by concrete and steel and the constant hum of human activity. I can't stand the quiet. I can't stand the woods. The silence is where they live. The silence is what lets you know they're watching. I don't sleep much. When I do, I have nightmares. Sometimes I'm back in the cabin, the walls shaking. Sometimes I'm on that road, watching Cal walk toward the darkness. But the worst dream is the one where I'm in the woods and everything goes silent. My life is different now. My days are normal enough, but my nights are spent online. I'm not a photographer anymore. I'm a researcher. I fall down rabbit holes of folklore, of cryptozoology, of missing persons cases in national parks. I look for stories like mine, and I find them. More than you would ever believe. Scraps and whispers from all over the world. People who saw something that shouldn't exist, who fought for their lives against an impossible predator, and who were met with ridicule and dismissal. They have names for it. Dogman, werewolf, skinwalker. The names don't matter. They're just labels we put on a truth our minds can't handle. The truth is, the world is not the logical, orderly place we pretend it is. The map has blank spots, and in those spots, monsters dwell. I know what I saw. I know what I fought. I know what I killed. And I know what killed my brother-in-law. It wasn't a bear. They are out there, in the deep, quiet places of the world. And they are intelligent. They are powerful. And they are real. So I'm telling you this, not because I want your pity, and not because I expect you to believe me. I'm telling you this as a warning. I am telling this for Cal, because his sacrifice has to mean something more than a line in a cold case file. Listen to your instincts. Heed the signs. If you are ever in the wild, and the world around you suddenly goes quiet, do not be curious. Do not try to be rational. Do not investigate. The silence is a warning. It means you've been seen, and you are no longer the hunter. You are the prey. Run.